So we are going to go ahead and get started. I'm Dee West. I'm the Associate Dean of Students and Director of Diversity and Inclusion and Hiring. I'm really excited today to welcome everyone to today's talk featuring Nekima Levy Pounds from Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota, the home of George Floyd, by the way. We're excited to be here today, although we're via Zoom. We want this to be a part of an ongoing conversation that we've been having all year about social justice issues, police brutality, and whatnot. So we're happy to have Nekima lead us in this part of the dialogue. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because we have other people on the panel who will be speaking today. I do have a detail that's important, that closed caption is available. If you go to the chat and you need closed caption, that's available to anyone who's interested and needs that feature. We're going to have the introduction, we'll have our president speak, and at the end we will have an opportunity for the audience to do a Q&A. So if you have questions for the speaker, please put them in the Q&A, and Michelle will be facilitating that opportunity. And we just hope that we can have this conversation. This is not just a talk, it really is a conversation, and it's an important one, particularly at this time that we're living in right now. So I will turn it over to President Haney, who will offer some opening remarks, and we'll go forward with the program. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dee, and thank you very much to you and everybody else who put together this great Martin Luther King Day program. As people often say, this is a year like none other than we've seen, and I think therefore it's a Martin Luther King Day like none we've ever seen. And it seems like just when just when we have enough reminders of the existence of systemic racism, something else comes along. Obviously we had the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. We've had COVID-19's disproportionate effect on Black and Brown people, both because of the economic divide in the country and because so many Black and Brown people are on the front lines. And then just last week, the difference between the way peaceful protesters in the Black Lives Matter movement and elsewhere, the violent way in which they were treated versus the ridiculously lenient way, the mostly white male group was treated as they were doing an insurrection in our nation's capital. What more evidence do you need? I think people often question themselves about, what to think about in this situation. And, you really do have to think about people in groups. One quote I was looking at today, here's the quote: "Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals." And you might recognize that quote from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. A lot of work to do here. And as Dee said, this is part of an ongoing conversation we've had on campus that I've been really had the privilege to be involved in. And really it's students like Destiny, you'll hear from in just a minute, who have really held our feet to the fire, especially mine, and in the best way possible, and really gotten us to think about what we need to do in terms of racial injustice, in terms of diversity and inclusion on this campus. As many of you know, we have a very large Black Lives Matter mural going up on the side of a building that faces State Route 700 on campus. Destiny was one of the leaders in that effort, and it caused a lot of conversation in the community. Not everyone was happy. I learned that all these great things are never going to happen fast enough for Destiny, which is just a great thing about her, is that she keeps us, continually reminds us of that. And so, but obviously we haven't, and we've another initiative that, and Michelle Nario Redmond's been very involved in these, just diversity initiatives on campus, trying to be more diverse in our hiring. But we have much more work to do along these lines. And so that's why I'm really looking forward to what Nekima Levy Pounds can help us here and inform our conversation. She's also, I mentioned earlier, I'm from just outside Minneapolis, Minnesota, so it's nice to see a fellow Minnesotan here. And I'm really excited to hear how she can help inform our thinking about these issues at Hiram as we work to become a more diverse and inclusive community and really do that work. So with that, I want to turn it over to Destiny Smith, a senior at Hiram, who unfortunately we're going to lose at the end of this semester as a student, though we will certainly stay in touch with her as an alum. You'll be getting a call very soon after you graduate. So I want to turn it over to Destiny, who will do our introduction for Nekima.
Thank you, President Haney, for all that you have done and will do, and I will keep your feet to the fire. I am honored here today to be introducing today's keynote speaker, Ms. Nekima Levy Pounds. She is a civil rights attorney, activist, national expert on racial justice, former law professor, and legal scholar. She previously served as professor of law at the University of St. Thomas Law School for 13 years, where she founded and directed the Community Justice Project, an award civil rights legal clinic. Nekima is the executive director of the Wayfounder Foundation, which provides for women of color, activists, and organizers around the country. Nekima is also the founder of Racial Justice Network, a grassroots organization that organizes and leads protests and demonstrations, provides community outreach and resources, and challenges injustices within the system that impacts Black people and other people of color in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities. Nekima's work has been featured in Associated Press, Crisis Magazine, MIC.com, Huffington Post, Men Post, and Star Tribune, to name a few. She has appeared on national news outlets such as CNN, PBS, Democracy Now!, Al Jazeera, America, News One, and HuffPost Live. Nekima is owner and principal consultant of Black Pearl LLC, a multifaceted company that provides business consulting and public relations services. She is also the co-creator of Asata Speaks. It's like TED Talks, but with much more swag. And then in 2020 and 2017, she was named 100 People to Know by Twin City Business. In 2016, she received the Distinguished Service Award from the Governor's Commission on Martin Luther King's Day. In 2015, she was named one of 40's Under 40 by Minneapolis and St. Paul Business Journal. In 2014, she was named Minnesota Attorney of the Year by Minnesota Lawyer and recognized as one of 50 under 50's most influential law professors of color in the country by Lawyers of Color magazine. She previously served as president of the Minneapolis NAACP and as an advisor to Black Lives Matter. She also ran for mayor of Minneapolis in 2017. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker for this Martin Luther King's Day, Ms. Nekima Levy Pounds.
Thank you so much, Destiny, for that robust introduction, and congratulations on being a senior and everything that you've accomplished. I'm personally proud of you, and I know that your peers and your teachers are as well. I want to thank D. West and President Haney for extending this invitation for me to join the Hiram community on such an important day in the history of Black America and in the history of this country. And I want to thank Brittany for all of her tech support, and all of you who are tuning in to this conversation. I think that we are at a very critical time in American history. And this is causing folks to pay attention to some of the things that many of us who've been on the front lines have been saying for a very long time with regard to the need to focus on racial justice and to do so boldly and unapologetically. So Destiny read off some of my accomplishments, but I think that at the core, what I want people to know and to understand is that without a focus on humanity and fighting for justice, my accomplishments really don't mean anything. It is more important to be concerned about those who are most poor, those who are most vulnerable, those who don't have a voice in our society, and being able to challenge the status quo and to stand up for their rights. Now, I want to share a little bit about my background to give you all some context for some of the comments that I'm going to make today. If people who are watching and tuning in are sensitive to the truth and the truth being spoken boldly and unapologetically, then I want to issue a trigger warning, because I have gotten to this place in my life as a 44-year-old Black woman, mother of 4, and attorney, where I have no choice but to speak the truth in the spirit of my ancestors, in the spirit of people like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Rosa Parks, Dr. King, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, and many whose names and identities we don't know, but who did everything that they could to stand up for our people. And so in terms of my background, I was born in Jackson, Mississippi, to a family that was working class, descendants of enslaved people, and who taught me the values of hard work, but also the kind of society that we live in, which is one in which we still have to be very careful as Black people in terms of at times where we go, what we say, and what we do, because of the level of scrutiny that we face that is unfair, but unfortunately is a part of how this country has been constructed. So my family taught me those things. And I had the benefit of growing up in what I would call a Black enclave. And a lot of times when we see Black communities, for some reason, we tend to ghettoize Black communities, and we treat people as if they're less than, especially if they're from a lower socioeconomic class. But I can tell you that the foundation that I had growing up in a Black community where people were working class, where many people were poor, it made me who I am today. So I have a lot of pride in that, and I am resilient as a result of what I experienced in my community. Now, when I was 8.5, my family moved from Jackson, Mississippi to South Central Los Angeles. That was a tremendous shift in terms of the kind of environment that I was in Mississippi, where it felt more like an enclave, to some of the issues that we encountered in South Central Los Angeles. Now, one of the reasons why moving to LA was such an important part of my life is the fact that I moved there in the mid-1980s at the start of the war on drugs. For those who are unfamiliar, the war on drugs is essentially one of the major reasons why we have a system of mass incarceration in this country that makes us #1 in the world for the number of people that we incarcerate. So in the United States, we have about 5% of the world's population, but 20% of its prisoners. And a big part of that has to do with the laws that made up the war on drugs. So in my community in LA, largely a Black and brown community, what we saw was underemployment and high rates of unemployment. We saw an oversaturation of law enforcement in those communities. And we saw the poorest of the poor being left behind in those communities. Now, in the early 1980s to mid-1980s, this was after the Civil Rights Movement, which began in the 1950s and essentially occurred throughout the 1960s with the assassination of Dr. King on April 4th of 1968. And so during that period of time, there was a push to not only dismantle Jim Crow laws, but also a push for integration of schools and integration of communities. And that push for integration seemed to be a good thing for some people, but there is a whole other side of the story in terms of how the push for integration had a detrimental impact on the Black community, because those who were middle class and upper middle class and who could afford to move out of the Black community and into predominantly white communities did so. So that left the poorest of the poor to fend for themselves. Beyond that, a lot of schools that were vital to the success of the Black community were closed down after the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954. And when that happened, we saw not only the schools closed, but we saw thousands upon thousands of Black teachers lose their jobs. and not have the opportunity to educate Black children. So I look at a place like Minnesota, where I currently live, and I see that our teaching population is 80, 90% white. And a lot of those teachers are teaching Black, brown, indigenous, and Hmong students. And there is a lack of cultural competency. So there are some byproducts that we don't talk about that impact us today. One of the things that was most important to me in both Jackson, Mississippi and in South Central Los Angeles was having Black teachers. I had Black teachers who treated me like I was their daughter, not like I was a menace to society. And unfortunately, in far too many of our classrooms, Black students are treated as if they are less intelligent, less capable of being successful, or a problem. And all of those attitudes and sentiments, which I would argue have their roots in slavery and the history of Jim Crow, make it easy for Black children to be pushed out of the classroom and into the juvenile justice system, and in too many cases onto the adult criminal justice system. So as a child growing up in LA, I began to witness all of these things unfolding. And I lived in LA during the time of not only the infamous Rodney King beating, where across America, millions of us watched a video beating of a Black man by multiple police officers. And we saw not only that beating, which was reminiscent of the way in which Black people were beaten during slavery and the Jim Crow era, but we saw those officers be tried through the criminal justice system that many of us have been taught to believe in and to trust in. And we saw those officers be acquitted. Even though we know that we all saw what we saw abuse, but we saw through the court system and the criminal justice process, the beating of a Black man who was unarmed being justified before the public eye, and those officers not being held accountable. Now in LA, at the time, of course, people were outraged. There were massive uprisings that happened, buildings burning, millions of dollars in economic losses, and literally hundreds of millions in economic losses as a result of those uprisings. In addition to people's rage and frustration in the aftermath of seeing the courts rubber stamp extreme police abuse, one of my former classmates, a young woman by the name of Latasha Harlins, had also been killed. Now her story does not get a lot of attention, but Latasha Harlins and I went to junior high school together. And what happened to her was my first indication that Black lives don't matter in the United States. Latasha was essentially 13 years old at the time. She walked into a corner store. In Los Angeles, most of the stores that we frequented were not Black-owned businesses. And so this was a store that was owned by a Korean family. A lot of our local stores were owned by Korean immigrants. And there was a lot of distrust between the Black community and the Korean American community, unfortunately, stereotypes and all kinds of issues that emerged. And so on one fateful day in March of, I believe, 1990 or 1991, Latasha walked into a local store with her little brother, and she walked to the back of the store to grab a bottle of orange juice. She took the orange juice, she put it in her backpack. She walked towards the front of the counter to pay for the orange juice. The woman who was the owner of the store was working that day, and she accused my classmate, my friend, Latasha Harlins, of stealing that orange juice. Latasha got upset. She and the woman got into a physical altercation over a bottle of orange juice that Latasha was about to pay for. She had the money in her hand at the time. And after their physical altercation, Latasha turned to walk out of the store, and the woman, Soon Jadu was her name, leaned over the counter and shot Latasha in the back of the head. And this was caught on video. And Latasha fell to the ground like a sack of potatoes, like an inanimate object. And when Soon Jadu was being tried for the murder of Latasha, one of the things that happened was that the court allowed a plea deal. And this was a white female judge who essentially justified the behavior of this store owner and snuffing out the life of a young Black girl, unarmed, trying to buy some orange juice. And Soon Jadu did no jail time for killing Latasha. She had to do 400 hours of community service and pay for Latasha's funeral. Of course, this led to a great deal of outrage, sadness, and frustration for us to be reminded that our Black lives had no value and that the courts didn't recognize the value of our lives. But around the same time, a man kicked a dog and got time in jail for kicking a dog in LA County, in the same area where Latasha was killed. So this sent the message that the life of a dog was more valuable than the life of a Black child, a Black person in our community. So all of those lessons had an impact on my own life in terms of understanding, one, how society has viewed historically Black people and continues to view us, and how the laws and policies may look neutral on their face, but the application of those laws and policies is not only not neutral, but often biased, and in many ways perpetuates anti-Blackness and discrimination. And so as a kid learning these things, it made me want to become a lawyer and to use the power of the law to stand up for justice and to fight for our freedom. So I'll fast forward a little bit in terms of going to law school and then becoming a law professor within 1 year of graduating from law school. I took a job at my alma mater, and then I came to work at the University of St. Thomas Law School in Minneapolis. That was in 2003. When I moved to Minneapolis, I was told it was a progressive place, a great place to raise my family, that our distressed communities aren't so distressed. And this was by a white female law professor. And that was my mindset for the first couple of years. And that was until I put down the mainstream white newspapers, and I started to pick up the local Black newspapers. And in those papers, I saw a completely different story in terms of how Black people and other people of color were being treated in a place that is supposed to be an oasis of progressivism. I read stories about Black people enduring police brutality, being discriminated against when applying for jobs, being the last ones hired and the first ones fired, having housing discrimination issues, being denied loans and things like that. And so I went to my dean when I saw this and said, I need to shift from family law, which is what I was doing at the time, running a family law clinic, to civil rights. And thankfully, the dean agreed. And from there, launched the Community Justice Project, which was a civil rights legal clinic. But in that clinic, one of the things that was very different was that rather than taking on a lot of individual cases, we decided to take on the system. So that brought us to the halls of power at the city, county, and state level in terms of challenging laws and policies that were perpetuating discrimination. Now, before launching the Community Justice Project and becoming an outspoken advocate for racial justice, I had to go through my own shifts and transitions. I stood at my own threshold, if you will, between the comfort and safety of working in the ivory tower, having a wonderful salary, benefits, knowing my family was protected, and then seeing the suffering that was happening in my community that was reminiscent of the things that I had read about historically and the stories that I had heard from my family as far as discrimination was concerned. And it took a lot of prayer and reading and processing and meditating for me to get to the point where I was willing to take the risk that I took in order to stand up for freedom, justice, and equality. And it is still a process. A lot of people think that because I'm Black, because I'm a Black woman, because I have had experience living in the inner city, that it's automatic that I'm going to be out on the front lines. And that couldn't be further from the truth. If it was that simple, we would have everybody out on the front lines taking the risk that we are forced to take just simply to stand up for our rights to be seen as human beings. And so I had to literally make a conscious decision, because when I first started to become outspoken, I did not have tenure. I was an assistant professor, which is the lowest rank of a professor. I had moved my family to a new jurisdiction, and I was beginning to take on a system that I was unfamiliar with. As a matter of fact, my first time speaking out at an event at my law school was a conference that we were hosting for judges and lawyers and parents and teachers and social workers, called How Are the Children? And we were looking at intersecting issues of education, juvenile justice, poverty, and mental health. One of the panels that we put on during that event included a white female prosecutor, a white female public defender, and a white male probation officer. And there was also a white man moderating that panel who was actually one of my colleagues, who wasn't a faculty member, but he was a lawyer and he was a staff member. During their panel, which was the only all-white panel at the conference, at the event that we put on, there were racist remarks coming forward. And I remember sitting there feeling so uncomfortable, thinking these are lawyers talking in a very negative and deficit-based and discriminatory manner about Black youth within their system, and being very disparaging about the communities and the families that they were a part of, and using that as a justification for some of the harsh treatment that these children faced in the juvenile system. I remember just being so upset and also feeling helpless and thinking, you know, what can I do? I'm a junior faculty member here. These are seasoned attorneys. They're white people. You know, what can I do? And finally, just through prayer in that moment, I just decided I have to take a stand. That's why I'm here. I have to do something beyond allowing this to play out and acting as if it's not a problem. So I arose from my seat. I went up to the podium and I said, based on the things that I have heard on this panel, I am going to close this panel early, and I'm going to address some of the things that I heard that were discriminatory and unacceptable. And so I began to respond to some of the racist remarks that I heard and the commentary. And of course, I was trembling as I made my statements to counter the things that they had to say. But it was also necessary to say something, even when you feel ill-equipped, when you feel fearful, when you don't know whether you're going to face repercussions. Standing up for justice has to become far more important than all of those things. And so in that moment, all those lessons from our ancestors, from the people who've come before us, kicked in, and I said, I have to do something. And so after I did it, I had a lot of people approaching me, thanking me, because they were so uncomfortable by what was being spoken. They didn't know what to do. And I was glad I did it, but I also faced backlash, because that prosecutor and that public defender wrote letters to the dean disparaging me as a result of my outspokenness. And so the dean sent me the letters and said, we should meet and talk about this. And so for 2 weeks, while waiting to meet with the dean, I'm sitting on pins and needles, not knowing if I'm going to have a job. And all I could do in that time was just pray and be affirmed that I had made the right decision, regardless of the outcome of the situation. Now, by the time I met with the dean said that he supported me, that I did the right thing, and that the prosecutor in particular probably should retire if she has this much venom and vitriol in her heart towards the people that she's supposed to serve. So of course I breathed a sigh of relief that I still had a job, and that I had done the right thing, and that I was a part of an institution that supported me taking a stand against racism, discrimination, and injustice. And that was a part of the reason that I stayed at St. Thomas for 13 years. It wasn't always a walk in the park, but knowing that I was a part of a faith-based institution focused on social justice, and that accepted me for who I became, which was an outspoken frontline activist in the fight for racial justice. Of course, they had no idea when they hired me that I would be engaged in street level activism, and I had no idea But the more that I stepped out into the community and on the front lines, the deeper I went to become an organizer and a freedom fighter. And I will say that one of the other shifts that I had to make beyond the experience that I just shared with you all was seeing the events that unfolded in Ferguson, Missouri in August of 2014 after Mike Brown was killed by Officer Darren Wilson. For those who may not know or don't recall, Mike Brown was a 17-year-old young African-American male high school student who had an encounter with police after crossing the street with a friend, and the police told him to stop. You know, there's different stories that emerge, but apparently he stopped, according to some of the witnesses, and put his hands up, as in like hands up, don't shoot. And the police officer shot him anyway. And not only was this 17-year-old boy, not man, boy, killed in cold blood with his hands up, his body lay in the street for 3 to 4 hours, baking out in the heat as if he was not human. I believe personally, after the experience I told you all about with my friend Latasha and the woman getting no jail time and the man who kicked the dog getting jail time, that an animal in Ferguson would have been treated better than what happened to Mike Brown. And so in the aftermath of that shooting, what we saw were uprisings that lasted for weeks and weeks and weeks. And just like many of you, I watched the uprisings unfold on television. I saw buildings on fire. I saw people protesting. I saw skirmishes with the police. And it looked extremely chaotic from my television set, and also filtering the news through the lens of the people who were present, capturing the news, who do not reflect the people who live in Ferguson, particularly the Black people who live there. And so I remember watching those events unfold and thinking, I'm safe here in the Twin Cities. This is not my fight. They have it under control. I will write about these issues. So I wrote a couple of articles about how the war on drugs and mass incarceration led to some of the unfolding events in Ferguson. And it wasn't until November of 2014, the day after the grand jury made the announcement that they were not going to charge the officer who killed Mike Brown, that I went to Ferguson, Missouri. Now, that night that they were going to make the jury announcement, I remember sitting at home on my computer screen, looking at different social media accounts of activists in Ferguson. And I was home with my children. And one of the things that happened was that there was a safe house in Ferguson where activists knew that they could go, and the police knew that this was a safe house. Well, on that night, first of all, the government in Ferguson decided to make the announcement late at night that the jury was not going to indict the officer, which I felt was a recipe for disaster. They knew that, the people would be enraged and upset, and to make an announcement like that at nighttime would only fuel the fire, knowing these people are outmanned, outgunned, et cetera, when it comes to any skirmishes with law enforcement. So that was the first red flag. And then as I'm watching the social media events unfold, one of the things that I saw was the police raid a safe house, a place called Maccabees. And what happened was that they threw tear gas through the windows and doors of the safe house. And on the social media video that I was watching, I could see little children screaming and crying because they had been tear gassed, and adults trying to pour milk of magnesia and milk in their eyes to stop the burning from happening. I started to weep when I saw this. The mother in me just felt so much compassion and sorrow from seeing those children being tear gassed, little kids too, that I just said, I have to go to Ferguson. And I reached out that night. I sent an email to the National Lawyers Guild asking how I could come and volunteer. And then I had a conversation with my kids. I said, I feel that God is calling me to go to Ferguson. And my son, who was 9 at the time, said, Mom, God said this is part of your journey. And that sealed the deal for me. I literally booked a flight, left, and went to Ferguson the next morning. I didn't know where I was going to stay. All I knew was the address to the National Lawyers Guild office. And I went to Ferguson, and there were several other lawyers as well as law students who essentially dropped everything and went around the same time that I did. And our job was to document police abuse, pick up, tear gas canisters and different things like that. And we got minimal training before going out to the front lines. And when I went out to Ferguson, in the area where all of the uprisings were happening, because there were two parts, where the uprisings were going on. One was a memorial area where Mike Brown was killed. The other was right in front of the police station and fire station, which were side by side. When we first got into town, what we saw were snipers on the rooftops of buildings. Those snipers were not police officers. Those snipers were men who called themselves the Oath Keepers, who had traveled to Ferguson for gas money to guard the buildings. And they were heavily armed, white men, is what I saw. And once we got there and saw them on the rooftops, they were pointing guns at people when you would get out of a car, asking you where you were going, like they were the authority. And I was shocked, because I'm thinking, you're some kind of force that's been allowed, like militiamen, to come here and act as if you are the police and exert control and authority over Black bodies. And the media was not talking about the Oath Keepers or even warning people that this was an element that was happening in Ferguson. And so throughout the process, we walked down the street, with some trepidation, because we didn't know what to expect. We got in front of the police station where a lot of the skirmishes were happening with protesters. And what we saw were mostly elders who were trying to keep the crowd focused on why they were there. And we saw young people as well who were on the front lines chanting and advocating and standing up for Mike Brown and other victims of police violence. And through that process, at one point, someone, got away from the crowd, and they went and set a police car on fire and flipped it over, and then set it on fire. And so all of the police that were guarding their buildings ran off, to that area. And so as legal observers, we were supposed to go wherever, the situations were unfolding. And we were standing there watching and documenting what happened. And the next thing you know, someone takes a bottle and they threw it at the back of a police SUV and hit the taillight. The next thing we know, a large, very large white male officer gets out of the back of that SUV. He puts on a gas mask, and then he proceeds to spray us all like we're insects with tear gas. No warnings, no nothing. And for me personally, being tear gassed, I thought, I was choking, first of all. I thought, what am I doing here? This is Thanksgiving week. I have my family at home, and I'm literally here in the middle of a war zone where we really have no protection if the police decide to further abuse us. And I remember choking on the tear gas. My eyes were burning, fluid coming out of my face. I had to pick up leaves off the ground to wipe my face and try to catch my breath. And while I was feeling sorry for myself for being out there, once the tear gas started to wear off, I looked around me and I saw young people who had also been tear gassed. But the difference between them and me was that right away, when that tear gas wore off, they went right back to chanting, marching, standing up for justice for Mike Brown and other people whose lives had been stolen by police. And so I said, if they can do it, I can do it. So I just found the resolve to stay there the rest of the week. And literally the day after I came back to the Twin Cities, I was approached by young people saying that they were going to start Black Lives Matter Minneapolis. Would I help them? And I had no idea how. I wore a suit to the first meeting because I'm thinking, I'm a lawyer, I'm a law professor. I don't know how I can help, with activism, but I showed up anyway. And to make a long story short, I was terrified but I also knew that I needed to be there. And our first action as a result of formulating that group, which was called Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, we shut down I-35 freeway in solidarity with Mike Brown, Eric Garner, and so many other people who had been killed by police during that window of time in 2014 between August and early December. And through that process, you know, as we're shutting down the freeway, of course, we have angry people driving by. We have the state troopers telling us on their loudspeaker, if you don't exit the freeway now, you will be arrested. One of the amazing parts about that process was before Ferguson, I would have exited the freeway like about 50 to 100 people did. But something in me shifted where I knew I have to keep going. These young people are going to keep going. I'm going to keep going. And so we did. We kept going. They didn't arrest us. We exited the freeway and we went straight to City Hall, and we confronted city council members and any of the elected officials who would come out about the lack of equity in Minneapolis and in the budgetary process and in their priorities as a city. Through that process of marching in the face of adversity, having the police encounter us and try to tell us that we had to stop, it took me back to the 50s and 60s and helped me understand what Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and so many others sacrificed in order to bring an end to Jim Crow laws and discrimination. Before that encounter where I was forced to make a choice, I read about their experiences, but in those moments, I felt connected in a spiritual way to what they went through. Because these were individuals who were peaceful, who were marching for justice, and who were treated like they were not human by those who were supposed to protect and serve. They were beaten on many occasions, sprayed with water hoses. They had police dogs sicked on them, and they were brought into the juvenile and adult criminal justice system merely for standing up for their right to move freely as citizens of the United States. Now, we think about the sacrifice that they made, but too often we take those sacrifices for granted. And we also fail to think about all of the white people who participated in the Jim Crow system of segregation by drinking at whites-only water fountains, using whites-only bathrooms, eating at whites-only lunch counters, sleeping at whites-only hotels, and sending their kids to schools that were reserved for white children. And when you think about that, the complacency and the ways in which the average white person is complicit in white supremacy and discrimination and systems and laws and policies that perpetuate injustice, it helps us to understand why we are standing at the threshold of American society right now in terms of whether we will fight for racial injustice, whether we will fight for our comfort and complacency, or whether we will allow those who do not care about justice to take control of what is happening in this country, especially as we become a more brown nation. I would argue that the events that just happened at the Capitol should be a wake-up call to everyone who says that they care about racial, social, and or economic justice. The sad part is that it took seeing primarily white men, but also some women with guns, with a resolve to destroy a government building, to kidnap people, to potentially murder people, for people to realize how serious the threat to our democracy is and has been from people who do not want to see us live and to see us breathe. And some could argue this is about a president who was supposedly cheated out of an election. But we know that the real issue is that the people who made the decision, some off-duty police officers, some former military, some neighbors and family members of people who might be watching this talk, that they felt threatened by the fact that our nation is becoming more and more brown, and they feel like they are losing something. They feel like they're losing power, control, and authority. And they were willing by any means necessary to send a signal that they're not going to be silent and they're not going to accept the shifts that are happening in our society. I would argue that if we had listened to Dr. King when he talked about the triple threats of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism, that we wouldn't be in this position. But too many of us have whitewashed Dr. King's message and the legacy and the blood, sweat, and tears that went into that fight for civil rights, and have gone into the shadows of their own comfort and complacency. And meanwhile, things have gotten worse for far too many Black and brown people in this country. People who are still relegated to the margins of society. People who are still denied access to their basic human rights. And as I started talking about in the beginning, being relegated to a system of mass incarceration, where there are currently now more than 2.3 million people incarcerated in this country, 40% of whom are Black, many of whom incarcerated for low-level, nonviolent offenses, a waste of human capital and people's lives, and perpetuating the destruction, particularly of Black and brown families. It is in that backdrop that someone like George Floyd could be killed in the city of Minneapolis, and have America once again be shocked by some of the brutality and inhumaneness that is perpetuated by those who are supposed to protect and serve. But if you are Black in this country, it's hard to witness these events, whether it's George Floyd, whether it's what happened at the US Capitol, whether it's what happened to Mike Brown, or going back to Emmett Till, or even Rosa Parks having to refuse to give up her seat and being incarcerated for that. We are not surprised. This has been the history of the treatment of Black people in this country. And we are asking white people who consider themselves to be allies to not only wake up, but to stay woke. And as you are awakened by what's happening, to do something about it. Talking about the problem is not enough. Condemning those of us who stand up for justice and shut down freeways or whatever methods of nonviolent resistance we decide to do, and demonizing us, that's not going to solve the problem. But getting involved and making it your personal mission to help eradicate racism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness will help to solve the problem. And it begins within our hearts and our minds, as well as what happens inside of our institutions. So I am going to stop there because I know that we want to have some time for Q&A, and I want to be respectful of that. Thank you.
So Michelle is going to lead us in our Q&A. Do we have any questions?
You're muted, Michelle.
Thank you. So hello, I'm Michelle Nario Redmond in the psychology department. I study stereotyping and prejudice, and I really do want to invite your questions and thoughts for our guest today, Nekima Levy Pounds, who just graced us with some provocative thoughts and personal experiences. So please do ask questions. We have one here that I'll start with, and then I'm going to wait a little while and ask my question. But so Nick Hirsch asks, he's a member of our biology department, and I'll say that Nick and I just recently did a panel on police bias for our college-wide campus. I'm losing the name of the teaching circle day. What am I forgetting about the name of this event? It's an annual event that followed 9/11 that we have that really gets students exposed to kinds of cool things. And it has the word teaching in it.
You can.
But anyways, Nick Hirsch has this question. What role do you see religion, particularly Christianity, playing in the struggle for social justice?
Right now, I think that unfortunately Christianity is a non-factor. And I'm saying this as a Christian and as an ordained reverend. Too often we see folks who go to church and worship and consider themselves do-gooders who are silent with regard to racial injustice and white supremacy. And some of whom unfortunately supported the current president in the White House and have been silent with regard to his involvement in the insurrection that happened. So that feels like a slap in the face for BIPOC people who consider themselves to be Christian. However, what we also have to understand is that religion has often been used to perpetuate white supremacy, racism, and discrimination, as we saw that biblical passages were used as a justification for the enslavement of African people here in this country. I think that the other aspect of it is what Dr. King said, that 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings is the most segregated hour in America. And again, he was saying that as a pastor who put himself on the front lines to remind Christians that they have adopted a form of Christianity that too often reinforces notions of white supremacy. So I would like to see the faith community take greater responsibility for injustice and to lock arms with those of us who are on the front lines and to use their privilege and power for good, rather than remaining silent in the face of adversity and injustice. You're muted, Michelle.
Okay, so the second question that comes up on our Q&A is from someone with anonymous, but they wanted to say thank you for the talk that was incredibly moving. And it was a raw new perspective that this person hadn't heard before. But they want to know what you would recommend for reaching out to our families who are particularly polarized towards far right and perhaps have racist thoughts and we want to be able to engage them in difficult dialogues and bring them back toward some kind of common sense and nonviolent approach. Mm-hmm. So that was the question. What would you recommend for reaching out to families who are particularly polarized?
Thank you for the question. We deal with this a lot in the Twin Cities, where because we have been marching and demonstrating since December of 2014, we have had a lot of white allies who have stepped up and who have trouble with regard to trying to get their family members to be more open and to be less openly racist and hostile towards the movement for Black lives. And some people succeed and some don't. And so what I say to people is that unfortunately we cannot change everyone, but those who have a willing ear to share your perspective with them, to educate them, to share books with them, to invite them to a protest or a demonstration. And I've seen some folks' hearts open as a result of that dialogue that happens. But there might be other family members who are so deeply entrenched in a mentality that centers around white supremacy that it may be hard to reach them. And so you have to choose your battles and where you want to spend your energy. But it's realizing that there will never be a time where 100% of the people are going to care about or be concerned for racial justice. But if you can get some family members and gather them and get them to be open, by all means, do what you can. And the way you do that is making sure you're educated, that you understand the history, and that you're able to articulate that from an authentic perspective.
Thank you. There are two questions here. I'm just going to jump to combine them since they're similar. One is asking, what are some specific concrete ways that folks can still be helpful, even if we can't go out on the front lines, helpful as allies or helpful of the movement more broadly? And then Another person right after that asked for examples of the kinds of things white allies might do to support the current civil rights and related movements, especially college students.
Mm-hmm. So I work with a lot of white allies in the Twin Cities. Some of them come out to protest, but many can't or don't. And so we asked them to do a number of things, figure out how to contribute time, talent, and or resources by supporting local grassroots groups or individuals who are out on the front lines. So in the midst of the George Floyd protests and uprisings that happened over the summer, a lot of that work was supported by white allies, some of whom would drop off cases of water, food, restaurant owners donating meals, people donating gas cards and gift cards and whatever we needed to continue to be out there on the front lines protesting. Additionally, we would do calls to action. So when the first media release went out that claimed that George Floyd was killed as a result of a medical condition, I found out it wasn't true, talked to the chief, went to social media about it to get people to start calling in to the governor and demanding that all 4 officers be charged for killing George Floyd, because they were planning to sweep the entire thing under the rug. And so that took not only BIPOC activists on the front lines, but it took white allies using their political power and social capital to make some of those phone calls, to send emails, to write letters to the editor of the local newspapers and stating a racial justice position on a situation like George Floyd being killed. Beyond that, we encourage people to hold their elected officials accountable. Too often, elected officials come knock on our doors, request our votes and support, and then they disappear. That's on us. When we elect these people into office and we don't hold them accountable for speaking out, standing against injustice, or changing laws and policies that are detrimental to Black bodies in our local communities. And I also encourage allies to not only support Black people and other people of color who are running for office, particularly on a racial justice platform, but to also run for office when it is appropriate and to use your privilege as a voice for justice. Thank you.
So some additional questions have come in, and I don't want to be a gatekeeper, but I'm sensitive to time. So I don't know if anyone wants, I want to mention one that asks President Haney to weigh back in before we're done, because I thought that was interesting. A viewer asked, what do you take away, President Haney, from the presentation, and how can Hiram be active and supportive? And maybe we'll have more time after that one.
Sure, I'm glad that was asked. What I'm thinking about is I love Nekima's expression, how to stay woke. And now that we've been awakened by all these incidents of, particularly of the past year, but really of, 400 years of history. And, the kind of personal experience that Nekima presented to us, gives a real, because you've obviously lived in many different worlds. I mean, from Mississippi to California to the very superficially progressive state of Minnesota that I know well. And how you kind of walk back and forth among those worlds for the sake of doing good and activism, I think is a real lesson to those of us who live in a privileged world of professors and lawyers and so on, and how I think you provided us with a great example of how you really can shift among those worlds, and you've also been very open about how difficult that is, even for you. So that to me is a great lesson of how we can move among those worlds. And I also have a question, which is the obvious question that I should ask is, how can I, as a college president, white college president with a not completely but largely white faculty and administration here, which is very classic, of schools like ours, but with a student population that's increasingly increasingly blacker and browner than it has been before. What advice do you have for us? What advice do you have for me for how we can, and I know Destiny has advice for me, but you know, what can we do? And I know one of the pieces of advice is listen to Destiny, and I get that. But you know, what else can I do? What can we do in order to, you know, continue to try to move things forward institutionally?
Thank you for that question. I'm really tempted to say, take it away, Destiny. But I think that part of what you can do, of course, is listen to Destiny and Dee and so many others who have insight in terms of what's happening in the community. One of the most difficult aspects of change is people willing to use their political capital to affect change. So it's not that change is impossible, but a lot of times institutions and leaders shrink back because of the backlash from, it could be alums, it could be current students, it could be families who do not want to see a shift like the ones that need to happen. And part of that is looking at the curriculum and making sure that it is not only not anti-Black and rooted in white supremacy, but it is intentionally anti-racism, anti-racist in terms of what comes forward. And that includes looking at how you select faculty and staff for the institution. When I was at St. Thomas Law School, I sat on our hiring committee, and I was one of, you know, I loved my colleagues. We had a great relationship, but for me, I wanted to know the ideology behind the people who were attempting to come work there, not just how great their credentials were or how scholarly their articles were, right? I wanted to know, how are you interpreting and understanding history, and how is that going to manifest in the classroom? Because even when race is not overtly being discussed, there are still going to be implications in terms of how comfortable students of color feel in the classroom. And a lot of that has to do with the professor being self-aware and understanding any biases or issues that they're bringing to the table that could impact how lessons are taught and how students of color are engaged and how white students are addressed as well. Too often when students of color raise concerns, they are seen as the problem and feel silenced inside of an institution, when really, knowing what we know about history, white privilege and white supremacy are the problem. And too often they've been unchecked. And that's why, you know, we have so many other concerns that unfold among students of color. You know, they're walking around in environments, they're facing gaslighting from people who are saying, there's not a problem, you brought the problem. Or you're complaining about something that doesn't exist. And what they're saying is, no, recognize that this institution, and I'm not saying yours in particular, but most, are built by and for the comfort of white people and the success of white people. And so the rest of us have to either learn to become comfortable and navigate that environment, or we have to leave. Those are usually our two choices. It's very difficult to be in an institution and be your whole self and to be accepted in that environment. Now, what I will say about my institution, even as I became more radical, more outspoken, advocating, I still got tenure. When I left the institution in 2016, I was a full professor of law with tenure. And part of that was because the institution, at least our dean, came to the understanding that there's room for a person like me in an institution like this, because 95% of our faculty is not like this. So if they can't accommodate an outspoken Black woman, then what's the point? So that's,
Thank you.
my advice.
Cheesecake is probably a fucking disaster.
So how are we doing on time? It's 6:05. There's lots of questions. I don't know, can our speakers see the questions and type in some answers later to some folks that, I mean, there are questions that relate to how you keep the faith, and whether you think there's a race war coming, or what legal laws we should be focusing on. But
so if Dee could, I'm not sure if I can take 3 minutes. I can
Sure.
go with the Q&A, and I can just quickly try to answer some of these questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's totally fine. That's fine.
Okay, great. And then if there's follow-ups, if the students or faculty or staff can reach out to Dee she can give me questions and I'll do my best to respond by email.
I'll do
So there's a question about being a Black woman. How do I keep the faith when being a Black woman means you have to fight to be heard? That's always, unfortunately, has been our legacy. So one way that I keep the faith is looking at the women who've come before me, like Harriet Tubman, who not only freed herself from slavery, but freed hundreds more. And this was at a time where she didn't have internet, she didn't have transportation, she didn't have an education, she didn't have money, but she did the impossible. And so I look at my circumstances, I think I have all the privileges and advantages, even being Black in a very racist society. If she did not make an excuse or didn't give up, then what excuse do I have? So that's how I keep the faith. I look at the people who've come before me, who persevered against all odds, and who made miracles happen. So that's my inspiration. And I lean very heavily on God and my faith. I pray sometimes at protests. Sometimes I'm throwing scripture at police officers, just saying, listen, you know, this is really about this life. It's a dressing room. How are you using your time and your energy, you know, in these situations? So that's how I keep the faith. Someone's asking about the Flint, Michigan issues, lack of punishment for those responsible. I think part of why there's a lack of punishment is because the majority of people in the state of Michigan don't care about the Black lives that are being impacted. Even, you know, liberal people, I mean, we can point the finger at Republicans and there's a lot of finger pointing that can be done, but we also have to shine a mirror at those who consider themselves Democrats, liberals, and progressives and ask, what sense of urgency did you have or do you have about how poor children and families are being treated in Flint? That is a humanitarian crisis. And we will have some of those same people fly halfway across the world to help feed starving children in another country to brag about it, but can't look in their own backyard at Black children who are suffering and lift a finger to help. There's a problem there. So they need to be held accountable, but that will only happen if the masses decide to use their power and privilege to hold them accountable and to demand justice. How does the criminal justice system undergo a meaningful transformation? Or is it a symptom of a larger issue? It's definitely a symptom of a larger issue. The criminal justice system has its roots in slavery. Look up the Black codes, look at the 13th Amendment. There's a documentary called 13th I recommend that people watch that played a role in a lot of the Southern states changing their laws to make standard behavior by Black people a crime. I look at the war on drugs, mass incarceration, all of that is connected to those roots. So we have to hold our elected officials accountable, even Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, because they played a role, unfortunately, in our system of mass incarceration. And so we need reparations for those who have been negatively impacted by the criminal justice system. We need to focus on children of incarcerated parents. We need to release nonviolent offenders, drug offenders in particular. They need to be let out, and they need opportunities. If marijuana is going to be grown in places where they demonized and criminalized and incarcerated Black and brown men, then they should be able to get out, have their records wiped clean, and have an opportunity to participate legally in that industry and not be demonized, because we're not demonizing white men who are selling drugs because now it's built into the institution. That's wrong. So we need to change those laws and policies leading to mass incarceration and stop funneling billions of dollars into that system to create jobs for mostly white men, unfortunately. Is America headed for a race war? I believe that that's what some people are hoping. You know, if the situation at the Capitol wasn't a wake-up call, I don't know what is. Some of these people are descendants of folks who fought in the first Civil War and who are angry and who still see the Confederate flag as their own version of the American flag. And so they've been, you know, being born and bred into these environments one generation after the next. We have to take it seriously and disrupt these types of groups and organizations. And again, you all saw with the most recent situation that a site like Parler, that was a breeding ground for white supremacy, was allowed to persist. And it wasn't until after what happened at the Capitol that Amazon decided to pull the plug. So when they were a threat to Black folks, Amazon made their money. There's a problem there. we have to hold these people accountable, and especially corporations. Corporations are not people. They shouldn't have the rights that we have. They need to be held accountable when they help violate our rights as Black people in this country and other people of color. Did the COVID pandemic, has it impacted our fight? We literally, first of all, we started going out in March, handing out thousands of cloth masks and sanitizer because the government did not have a plan for getting those supplies to Black community members. We knew we were going to face health impacts, so we had to go out early in the pandemic and give out supplies on our own, mobilizing allies to sew masks and donate sanitizer. Beyond that, George Floyd was killed on May 25th in the midst of the pandemic. We couldn't just sit at home after this man was killed and the way he was killed. We took to the streets wearing our masks, and so it didn't impact us. We continued the fight for justice. We just tried to do it as carefully as we could. And we're still out there. We were out there today marching in the midst of a pandemic to stand up for justice. What 3 to 4 laws promote racial justice? I think, again, looking at the war on drugs, it's a war on Black and brown and the poor. Those laws that make up the war on drugs need to be dismantled. Mandatory minimums need to be uprooted because they give a mandatory sentence for anyone caught with a certain amount, regardless of your level of culpability. And that has brought more Black and brown women and mothers into the system, and they don't belong there. It is a waste of time, resources, energy, and human capital. Beyond that, we need to stop having people on probation for so long. And we need to ensure that people have an opportunity to return home and have access to a job, which means we might need to bring back more manufacturing and be more intentional and not send everything to other countries, but really begin to build here, rebuild our economy so that the average person in their community who wants to work has the opportunity to work. And I'll end here. I see that as a manifestation of Dr. King's focus on ending the war on poor people in this country. I believe that that was a part of the reason that he was assassinated. He said, we're going to start a poor people's campaign. We're going to Washington, D.C. We're not going to leave until we get what we came for, a guaranteed maximum income, affordable housing, universal health care. That is a huge part of his legacy that has not been addressed in the way that it should. And that would mean challenging the system of capitalism and ensuring greater levels of equity for all people.
Well, thank you very much, Nekima. We really appreciate, I know I speak on behalf of everyone in this community. Thank you for your energy, your talk, your care, your love, and I know for certain for everything that you're doing for the nation, for the world, and certainly for the Black and brown community. We appreciate you greatly. When I first met you, I knew that it felt right and felt kindred, and there's so many opportunities for us to grow and learn. And they always say, oftentimes when we have these kinds of events, people say, well, you just get the converted folks. They already know, they're already on board. But there's also a saying that even the choir needs rehearsal. So this was a great rehearsal, great opportunity for us to use this day to reflect, to think about the complexity of what we're dealing with. I also want to thank our president, who is leading the charge in a cool, calm fashion. He's leading the charge, and we need that. I mean, we do need that type of leadership. Our Vice President, Judy Meiskin, stands in the gap. Our faculty, our staff, our students, Destiny, Michelle and Colin, and so many people within this community that certainly are energized and re-energized by your comments. And know that you're taken seriously. We know this is just not just a talk. These are not just words, but you are taken seriously, and we want to have these kinds of discussions because we want to make a difference. And we want to be that kind of community. So thank you so much. If we could hug you, we hug you, but we'll give you a cyber hug and the cyber thank you for all that you've done for us this evening. And be safe. You know, in this community, it's tough out there, but be safe.
Thank you
so
so
thank
much.
you everyone else for coming. I'm sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
I would just say thank you. It was my honor to be with you all tonight. Thank you for blessing my son.
Absolutely. We do have some students who will respond to your talk and respond. They'll have their perspectives on race, and because I know you can't attend, you have another event to attend, but they will be responding and it will be recorded. So if you like the recording, we'll send it to you. And as mentioned prior, if people have questions for Nekima, please send them to my email and we'll get those to her. If you have questions or thoughts or things that you'd like some consultation on and whatnot. The next program is at 7 p.m. It's in a different Zoom room. You have that in your email, and it will be students who will be sharing their views on race and anti-racism. So thank you guys, and this ends this part of our program. Thank you.